Hello, everybody. This week we're going to be reading two parashot in Shul, Parashat Matos and Masei. They also happen to be the last two parashot of Chumash Bamidbar. So when we finish the laning, we're going to announce Chazak, Chazak, Vinit Chazik, because we will have finished Chumash Bamidbar. In these two parashot, we review the journey that Bnei Israel have taken since they left Mitzrayim, through the Midbar, through the land of Edom, Moab, and Ammon. And I'd like to discuss with you today a very famous story that took place when Bnei Israel reached the Yarden, the Jordan River. At that moment, when Bnei Israel stopped on the eastern side of the Jordan River, Gad and Reuven looked around at the eastern portion of Eretz Yisrael, the land that was on the east side of the Jordan River, and they noticed that the land was very fertile. There was a lot of grass, there was a lot of water, there was a lot of wide open spaces for their cattle to roam. Now, these two particular tribes, Gad and Reuven, had a lot of mikneh, a lot of cattle. So they asked Moshe, can we receive our portions of land, our nachalot, here on the eastern side of the river? This was a lot for Moshe to consider, whether or not Bnei Israel should be separated, 2 tribes on one side of the river, 10 tribes on the other. What would happen for kibush haaretz? What would happen during the wars, the conquest of the land? At the end of the parak, Moshe comes to bring the response to this request. And it says in the pasuk, Vayitin lahem Moshe livnei Gad, livnei Reuven, ulechatzi shevet Menashe ben Yosef. Moshe returns and he tells them, yes, you, Gad, you, Reuven, and you, half of Menashe, can receive portions on the eastern side of the river. But if you remember the original request, it was only made by Gad and Reuven. So there are 2 questions that we have now that we learned this pasuk. First of all, why did Menashe receive lands if they weren't in the original request? And if Menashe was to receive land, why were they split into 2? Take a look at the map of the Nachalot, and you could see that Menashe is the only tribe split in 2. Every other tribe receives just 1 Nachalah. So I want to share with you a few ideas as to why that happened. The first is the answer of the Ramban. He says a very practical answer. He says that just like Gad and Reuven had a lot of mikneh, so did Menashe. They also needed land, so it made a lot of sense. Moshe needed more people to live there and benefit from the expansive land. He asked for volunteers. So those that had cattle stepped up and said, oh, we also need space. Second answer is a little bit different. The second answer is the answer of the Netziv. The Netziv says it was with very much intention. Moshe was worried that Gad and Reuven would be too far from the Beit HaMikdash. They would be too far from the Torah centers that were going to be established on the western side of the Yarden River. And Moshe specifically searched out teachers, Torah leaders, Rabbanim, who would ensure that Gad and Reuven would still feel the connection to the holiness that would exist on the western side of the river. So certain Torah leaders from the Shevet of Menashe volunteered to take that responsibility, to be teachers on the eastern side of the river. But we're still left with the question about why the tribe was split in half. The Siftei Kohen tells us that Moshe looked for a tribe that was big enough to be split in 2 because he wants to ensure the unity of Am Yisrael. If Menashe had a portion of lands on the east side of the river and a portion of lands on the west side of the river, they would specifically communicate back and forth with each other. The families would stay connected, thereby making sure that Gad and Reuven would also stay connected because news would travel back and forth between the eastern side of Israel and the western side of Israel. Finally, there is an answer that I would like to share with you from the Kol Torah, from Rav Monk. Rav Monk looks specifically at this pasuk, and he notices something unusual. He says that when Moshe approached Gad and Reuven, they are referred to only by their names, Gad and Reuven. But in this pasuk, Menashe is called Menashe ben Yosef. So Rav Monk says there must be something that the words Ben Yosef can teach us. Rav Monk says that Yosef had a very strong and passionate love and attachment to Eretz Yisrael. We know this especially because he asked his children to promise him that his body would be buried in Israel. And in Yetziat Mitzrayim, Moshe himself made sure that that promise would be kept. And Yosef's body was taken from Mitzrayim and was buried in Eretz Yisrael. So Rav Monk says, let's look at the words Ben Yosef, and it reminds us how much love Yosef HaTzadik had for Eretz Yisrael. This was Menashe's legacy, the love and attachment to the land of Israel. So Moshe wanted to make sure that the legacy of Yosef would be both on the eastern side of the river and the western side of the river, that all of Am Yisrael, no matter where they lived, would feel the impact of the legacy of Yosef. So as we are approaching Tisha B'Av, today we start the beginning of the 9 days. Let's keep these ideas of Menashe in mind. Learning Torah, unity, and love of Eretz Yisrael. Shabbat Shalom.